Hello, my name is Cefalu. I am a junior here at Meredith College, majoring in biology and psychology. My research is titled Relationships Between Mental Health and Academic Behaviors in College Students. And I was advised in this project by Dr. Edwards and Dr. McPherson. So first I'm going to introduce the need for my research, its purpose, talk about some background literature, and then go into my hypotheses before talking about my method, results, and discussion. So research by Ferguson and Woodward from 2002 and Newcomb and Anjo in 2017 has shown that college students persevere through stressors, but they're fairly adept at handling this stress without sacrificing their academic performance. However, many of these same researchers and others have questioned the well-being of students who may sustain high stress levels for prolonged periods of time. A student's motivation and procrastination can play an important role in maintaining their academic performance, but currently there's not a lot of extensive research about how these variables interact. So keeping this previous research in mind, when I conceptualized my project, I asked, how does a student's motivation style interact with their procrastination level? How does this interaction differ for students who may be experiencing symptoms of depression and anxiety? And is academic performance affected by any of this? So from my literature review, I was able to conclude that student depression is a phenomenon where symptoms present differently than adult clinical depression. For instance, disruptions in eating and sleeping schedules are usually indicators of adult depression, but in students, this can often just be a consequence of university life. Instead, students who are experiencing depression may exhibit perfectionist ideation or an extreme lack of focus. Svanem and Zodi, as well as Solomon and Rothblum, they found that depression does not have as large an influence on academic performance as was previously hypothesized, and having no significant interactions between depression and academic performance is an indicator that student resilience is present despite them facing many challenges. Depression does have a well-documented relationship with the presence of anxiety and procrastination, and there's evidence that the combination of these variables may not be enough to impact academic performance. Anxiety in an academic context has been proposed by Desiderato and Koskinen to be either facilitating or debilitating. So facilitating anxiety can act as a motivator for students, while debilitating anxiety will most often appear as a fear of failure. According to information, again, collected in my literature review, little evidence has been found of anxiety negatively impacting academic performance. In studies by Desiderato and Koskinen, as well as Phantom and Zodi, students experiencing anxiety were actually recorded to have higher grades than students not experiencing anxiety. So procrastination can be defined as putting off or delaying a task with knowledge of an impending deadline until discomfort or anxiety is felt. There are six unique aspects of procrastination that are described by Kaftan and Freund, which are a person's psychological beliefs regarding their abilities or their self-efficacy, distractions, social factors, time management, personal initiative, and laziness. And all of these play into how often and to what extent a student procrastinates. Previous research by Kaftan and Freund, Solomon and Rothblum, and McCloskey and Shielzo all note that high procrastination has been observed to coincide with high exhibition of depression symptoms. According to self-determination theory developed by Ryan and Deci, there are three main types of motivation that exist on a spectrum. So the left end of the spectrum is intrinsic motivation, of which there are three subtypes. So the first is to know, meaning that someone is motivated simply for the sake of gaining knowledge. The second is to accomplish, meaning that the person is motivated to feel a sense of accomplishment and pride in oneself. And the third is for stimulation, which means that the person enjoys the feeling of stimulation that comes with learning new things. Moving down the spectrum is extrinsic motivation, and again, there are three subtypes. So the first is introjected, meaning that someone is motivated to avoid guilt or because they know whatever they're doing is important or has value. Second is identified, meaning that the person has a clear purpose to be motivated, whether that be to graduate school or simply complete an assignment. Third is external regulation, where a person is motivated to avoid punishment or gain praise. The third main type of motivation, on the opposite end of the spectrum from intrinsic, is amotivation, which is a lack of motivation. Studies have found that depressed students are more often have extrinsic motivation types, and research in this area has kind of circled around and asked this question, but not answered. Does student motivation change based on well-being or mental health symptoms? So now let's get into my hypotheses. My first hypothesis was that students who score higher on depression measures will be more likely to have extrinsic motivation styles, higher procrastination levels, and lower GPAs than students who score lower on depression measures. And my second hypothesis was that students who score higher on anxiety measures will be more likely to have intrinsic motivation styles, lower procrastination levels, and higher GPAs than students who score lower on anxiety measures. So next, let's get into my methods. So these are the scales that I used. First, we have the University Student Depression Inventory, or the USDI, which was developed by Kawaja and Bryden in 2006 to specifically measure student depression and its symptoms, which differ in presentation from clinical depression. So an example of one of the questions on this measure is, I don't have the energy to study at my usual level. Students would rate these statements on a 5-point Likert scale, and higher scores indicated higher levels of student depression. Next, I used the anxiety subscale of the Depression Anxiety Stress Scale, or the DASS, which was developed by Lovabond and Lovabond in 1995. This is a 7-item subscale measuring physical symptoms of anxiety. One example of a question included on this measure is, I felt that I was close to panic. Students were asked to rank how often they had felt these statements over the past week, and higher scores indicated higher levels of anxiety. I also used the college version of the Academic Motivation Scale developed by Valrand et al. In 1993. This scale is 28 items measuring the 3 main types of motivation. So an example of an intrinsic motivation statement is, I experience pleasure and satisfaction while learning new things. An extrinsic statement would be, I want to obtain a more prestigious job later on. And an example of an amotivation item is, I really feel that I'm wasting my time in school. Students were asked to identify how strongly each of the statements related to their current reasons for attending college or university. And this was on a 7-point Likert scale. For analyses, student totals were calculated for both intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. Next, I used the Academic Procrastination Scale developed by McCloskey and Shielzo in 2015. This measure contains 25 items focused on assessing procrastination behaviors. An example of an item on this measure is, I put off projects until the last minute, and students were asked to rate on a 5-point Likert scale how strongly their habits and routines related to these statements. Lastly, I developed a short demographic questionnaire that asked participants their class affiliation, GPA, and what college or university they attended. No other identifying information was collected to protect confidentiality, as participants, a majority of the participants also attended Meredith. I developed my survey through Qualtrics software, and a department-wide email was sent to Meredith's Department of Psychology and Social Work, and 2 social media posts acted as snowball sampling methods, and my data was collected during the month of September 2020. I had a total of 61 participants. 39 of those participants fully completed my survey, and 22 did not. So I ran my analyses twice, once with only complete surveys and once including incompletes. There was no significant difference between the 2 groups, so I chose to report with the larger sample. Most of my participants were from Meredith College and were recruited through that email, but a small percentage were recruited through social media and snowball sampling, which helped me get a few more participants from local universities. And the mean GPA of my participants was 3.55, and there was one outlier of 1.20, but this outlier didn't significantly affect my analyses and therefore was included. I completed my analyses using SPSS, and I conducted Pearson correlations, a MANOVA, and multiple linear regression analyses. So next we're going to move into my results. So as expected, due to their established and often comorbid relationship, depression significantly positively correlated with anxiety, and this is in the red square. It's also important to note that intrinsic and extrinsic motivation were significantly positively correlated with each other. So this could indicate that it's either a presence or absence of motivation that influences students and not necessarily the type. And this correlation's in green. And in the purple square, we can see that procrastination was also notably positively correlated with amotivation. Looking at my first hypothesis, we can see that depression was not significantly correlated with any extrinsic motivation style, and this does not support what I predicted. Instead, it was significantly correlated with all three types of intrinsic motivation. So depression was positively associated with motivation for stimulation and negatively associated with the other two intrinsic types. Depression was also highly significantly associated with higher levels of procrastination as well as amotivation, as I predicted. And the last part of my hypothesis was not supported because there was no interaction between depression and GPA. So now looking at my second hypothesis, we can see that anxiety was only significantly correlated with one type of intrinsic motivation, which was for stimulation, and it didn't correlate with any extrinsic motivation subtypes. However, it did significantly correlate with amotivation and procrastination. There was no relationship there. So here we can see that anxiety has no significant relationship with procrastination. And lastly, there was no relationship between GPA and anxiety. So my MANOVA examined depression and anxiety as independent variables, and motivation and procrastination scores were dependent variables. Depression and anxiety were coded as nominal, and cutoff scores were established based on criteria developed by the authors of those scales. And this was used to create groups of students who were depressed, not depressed, or anxious and not anxious. There was not a statistically significant interaction effect between depression and anxiety on the dependent variables. However, there was a significant main effect of depression on procrastination. And pairwise comparisons revealed that depressed students had significantly higher procrastination scores than their non-depressed peers. However, non-depressed students still displayed a significant amount of procrastination. For my multiple linear regression analyses, depression and anxiety were coded nominally, again in those same groups. And my outcome variables were intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, as well as procrastination. The only significance I found was that procrastination was a significant predictor of depression, which was what I predicted in my first hypothesis. So next we're going to move into my discussion and what these results mean for both students and institutions. So relating my findings back to my first hypothesis, I predicted that students with higher depression scores would be more likely to have an extrinsic motivation style. Depression was highly associated with intrinsic motivation for stimulation. So it's possible that students who are depressed and experiencing symptoms such as anhedonia or lethargy use schoolwork and the feeling of satisfaction when completing a task to experience intellectual stimulation. Next, I predicted that students with higher depression scores would possess higher procrastination levels. This was supported by my data because in both my MANOVA and linear regressions, procrastination was found to be a significant predictor of depression. Kawaja and Bryden's 2006 study on student depression mentioned that perfectionist ideation is a common symptom, and there's a potential for perfectionism to play a role in procrastination and depression. And I talk about this in a later slide. Lastly, I predicted that students who scored higher on depression measures would have a lower GPA. This was not supported by my data. I found no interaction with GPA, which could be attributed to low variance in my sample. So next was my hypothesis about anxiety. I predicted that students who scored higher on the DASS would be more likely to be associated with an intrinsic motivation style. This is only partially supported because anxiety was correlated with only one type of motivation, which was intrinsic for stimulation. So yes, anxiety was associated with an intrinsic motivation style, but not all intrinsic motivation styles. I also predicted that students who scored higher on the DASS would possess lower procrastination scores. And in all of my analyses, procrastination had no evident relationship. The DASS measured physical symptoms of anxiety and didn't capture the cognitive symptoms that may be important in relating anxiety to procrastination. So the non-significance indicates that a relationship may exist between these variables, but it wasn't detectable with the sample. And lastly, I predicted that students who scored higher on the DASS would have higher GPAs than other students. As stated before, there were no significant interactions with GPA, possibly due to low variance. So this slide is a continuation of my discussion on perfectionism's potential role in the relationship between procrastination and depression. Perfectionism is the establishment of outlandishly high standards for oneself and others, and this model is based on control theory developed by Carver and Shire in 2012. So when there's a discrepancy between a person's standards for completing a task and their actual ability to complete a task, procrastination may occur. So going through this diagram, if a task is assigned and realistic expectations are set, the task is usually able to be completed on schedule. However, when unrealistic expectations are set and the person is not able to meet those standards, they may procrastinate the task, potentially leading to feelings of guilt or loss of interest or hopelessness. And these feelings can become symptoms of depression and cause task abandonment. Future research should be conducted about the role of perfectionism in the procrastination and depression causal relationship, because from this understanding, models can be developed to help students learn self-efficacy and realistic task completion skills. So to continue the discussion of tools available to students to aid in decreasing procrastination behaviors, I've laid out some current strategies, how they can be improved, and some suggestions for the future. So my study concluded that procrastination particularly affects students who experience more or a higher frequency of depression symptoms. Right now, student interventions about procrastination focus on time management and study skills, but in studies completed by Glicken Orzillo, Kaftan and Freund, and Rothblum and Solomon, these strategies weren't effective in reducing procrastination. So current procrastination solutions may not address a student's self-efficacy in the face of difficult tasks, pre-existing perfectionist ideation, or circumstantial intricacies that could influence student procrastination. However, there are some new strategies that have the potential to more effectively address procrastination or low motivation. So first, we have anxiety reduction focused counseling, which was originally suggested by Rothblum and Solomon. This type of counseling focuses on students who feel an intense fear of failure or nervousness about impending deadlines, which can cause them to avoid a task. So reducing anxiety could look like helping a student overcome fear of a difficult topic or one that's outside their normal area of study. It could also look like helping a student talk through natural and logical outcomes of completing an assignment to reduce fear of failure. Next is acceptance-based behavior therapy developed by Glick and Orzillo. This type of therapy encourages students to accept procrastination as a natural part of the task completion process and to not force productivity, but accept and take advantage of it when possible. So working with a student's natural productivity schedule may not necessarily decrease procrastination significantly, but it can mitigate negative cognitions that could lead to depression. Lastly is goal focus versus process focus, as explained by Kaftan and Freund. So this study found that when students paid more attention to the individual steps or process of finishing an assignment, procrastination occurred less frequently than when students focus on the culminating goal of the assignment. Process focus helps break down larger assignments into smaller, more manageable tasks, which could aid in reducing anxiety, as well as prevent the accumulation of unrealistically high standards and thus procrastination. So with all of these results in mind, it's important to consider some limitations of the present study. Perhaps a larger, more diverse sample could more clearly and accurately display the relationships or lack thereof between these variables. For example, the current study had a low range of anxiety, depression, and GPA scores, and also the majority of my sample was from Meredith. Second, the study was cross-sectional and only assessed students' current state. Studies by Andrews and Wilding, as well as Kaftan and Freund, were longitudinal and were able to more holistically evaluate the process of procrastination, as well as changes in depression, anxiety, and motivation. Lastly, data collection occurred during the COVID-19 pandemic. School structure has shifted dramatically in the past year, and as the study assessed academic behaviors, some of the data may have been influenced by these extenuating circumstances. So to end with a look to the future, the additional studies are necessary to find what motivates students to do work. It's possible that resilience could be a topic of interest as students sustain their motivation and uphold academic achievement despite stressors that may negatively impact mental health. Additionally, future research should continue to address perfectionism and procrastination, especially as it relates to students who experience symptoms of depression. Findings in this area of study can help institutions develop specialized programs for students that will support their academic work without sacrificing their mental health. I would like to extend my thanks to Dr. Edwards for her support in collecting my data, Dr. McPherson for advising the manuscript of this project, and Jenna Curia for continual support throughout my analyses. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation. And if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me at the email listed on the slide.